And the question I was asked to respond to is where do you feel we're out of kilter in the city? And many of the themes that you've picked up this morning came to mind as I pondered this. And I think at the heart of where I want to begin in terms of where we're out of kilter is our ability to handle the degree of anxiety that we're currently asking ourselves and others to handle right now. So I think our ability to work with anxiety in a creative rather than a destructive way, in the population that I'm working with and in my experience to date, is what is most out of kilter right now. And I think what that leads to is a degree of violence, and I thought long and hard before using that word. I don't mean it in the sense of physical violence necessarily, but I think our inability to process our own anxiety and those of others leads to a violence towards self, and I'll explain more of what I mean about that in a moment, and a violence towards others. And we've heard some examples of that already this morning. There have been some really extreme examples in the press very recently to do with the city and the financial services sector, and I think they're valid, but they're just the very tip of the iceberg from our experience, and I'm sure quite possibly from yours as well. The anxiety stems from a very difficult tension that most of the people we work with are being asked to work inside currently. And that is to work with two conflicting demands from the people who lead them. The first demand is to be creative, to really go out there and challenge the status quo, to transform the businesses that they're currently in, to push aside old models of working and create new ones. And the other message, which is sometimes implicit and often explicit, is take no risk. And of course it's very difficult to bring those two worlds together in the same place. Be creative and, by the way, take no risk whilst you're being creative. Change the world, and by the way, don't rock the boat too much. Yeah? Go out there and make everything different, and don't create too much of a mess in terms of the way things currently are. Yeah? And I think what that generates is a degree of anxiety which people don't really know what to do with. They really don't know what to do with. I mean, certainly since 2008, maybe for longer, the main emphasis in the clients we work with is to eliminate jobs and free up capital. Essentially, if you boil it down, they can wrap it up in all kinds of language, but essentially they want their senior leaders to take jobs out and free up capital. And it's hard to do that when you're also trying to be really creative, because creativity often requires you to use capital and create jobs. Yeah. And so, if you're struggling with that tension, I think at an individual level, anxiety that can't be managed leads to some of the themes we've already heard today. Loss of meaning is a really substantial one. A high emphasis on individualism at the expense of building community and trust. A degree of impotence in terms of really being able to move the things you want to move, make the changes you want to make in your organisation and in the world at large. Inequality, injustice, inequity, and lots of inhibition. So often the unprocessed anxiety ends up in these places, and most of the people we work with are having immense difficulty trying to navigate that territory. And of course, because they've all been so successful to date, they think the way out of it is to work harder and to do more. Which leads to this concept of people being always on. Always on. I'm doing some work with a telecoms company at the moment, and I was just in a conversation with them 2 weeks ago. Their HR director was saying to me that, and this may be familiar to you, Lee, I'm not sure, that there's a process now by which people can carry around monitors all day and all night to monitor their stress levels. And they were doing this as a team evaluation of some kind for an executive team. And she said, I wasn't shocked by seeing people's moments of stress, but the big shock to me was how stressed they were when they were sleeping. That was a bit mind-blowing to me. You know, to think that the amount of stress that we are generating for ourselves now means that even in that most precious of moments, those very few hours we get to sleep, when we imagine that that's the time when we're recovering, regenerating, recuperating, actually these monitors were showing the stress level staying, almost as high, and certainly above the norms that you'd want for someone who's in a recovery phase. And that always on way of coping is a defence, as far as we can make out, a defence against feeling this anxiety that I'm referring to, that sense of being out of control. So you put yourself always on and work harder. And of course there are other defences as well that we see in our client base. Lots and lots of addictions, drugs, alcohol, affairs, all ways of ensuring that the stuff that needs to be felt in terms of how anxious and how out of control I might be is not felt because I'm distracted or defended against those feelings through some other mechanisms. So I think when I talk about violence towards self, it's in that domain, you know, that our inability to handle this anxiety leads to a degree of violence against self, which is manifested in the ways that I've just been describing. The organisational level of not being able to handle anxiety is that they currently, and I'm generalising massively here, there are pockets of brilliance, but at a general level, organisations still think of change as quite a static thing, by which I mean they imagine there's a period of stability, and then they'll put themselves into action and enable some new stuff to happen, and change the stuff that needs to happen, and then they'll return to a period of stability, and then when the next change is needed, off they'll go again, and you see, we change, we stop, we change, we stop, and of course that just isn't the reality. I doubt it's ever been the reality, but it certainly doesn't feel like the reality today. And so, at an organisational level, the relationship to anxiety is to get more and more and more controlling, to think that the way through it is through process and transaction and task and management and planning, and completely ignoring the possibility that there may be other ways of leading, enabling, facilitating change that don't rely on that model. So it's becoming quite outdated, quite out of. It's just not fit for purpose anymore, and yet there's more and more emphasis on it as a simple way of approaching change. Again, from a client perspective, I was talking to a bank on Monday. They wanted to talk about how we might help them develop some change capability, change agents in their business. And I asked them what the scale of this work was, and they said we have 200 transformational projects on at the moment. Which again is another stat that just blows my mind, you know. And by transformational, it's not lazy use of language. They mean projects that are significant in terms of the money they're trying to create or save, highly complex, very interdependent, multiple stakeholders, really ambiguous. Most of them have not been done before. It's of that kind of quality, and they, just from the ones they know about, we're counting 200 of those. So that just really kind of blows my mind that you've got that level of complexity trying to be handled by what is essentially a very basic, simple and outdated model as to how change comes about. So of course, that organisational anxiety needs somewhere to go, and where it goes often is towards violence towards others. And again, I use that word guardedly, but what I mean by that is the kinds of themes we've talked about here today. Autocracy, bullying, over-control, diminishment of others, pushing work down the hierarchy, the most junior people in the organisation having the most difficult time. We talked this morning about the sad death of an intern at Merrill Lynch recently due to overwork. Or certainly whatever their causative factors may have been behind that, overwork was a trigger. And also very sadly, in the press in just the past couple of weeks, which I'm sure many of you will have heard about, the CFO of Zurich Insurance, a global business, a member of the board, committed suicide, and left in his suicide letter an indication that it was some kind of pressure from the chairman that had caused this event to happen. The ins and outs of it we can't know, but there's violence all around that. There's violence towards self in terms of suicide, but there's also this kind of relatively violent act, leaving this accusation that this chairman has no possible chance of being able to address or redress. The chairman's name was Joseph Ackerman, the ex-CEO of Deutsche Bank, and he resigned, and the board accepted his resignation. Now, they haven't talked about the ins and outs of that. I wouldn't expect them to, but I think, again, it's a kind of tip of the iceberg piece of data as to what this inability to handle this level of anxiety, this level of stress, can ultimately lead to. And these are just the cases that are publicised. There's lots and lots of this kind of difficulty going on inside the organisations in which we walk, and I think if the real magnitude of it's in some way quantified, it would blow everyone's mind. So, have I depressed you enough? generally. I think that it can be a relatively dark picture. I can end up sounding too dark about it. There are rays of light within all of this, particularly in the populations that we're working with at the moment. I think it's not cause and effect in terms of our work is causing the ray of light. I think the very people who want really to challenge the status quo are rays of light in and of themselves. If there are a couple of characteristics that enable them to stand out, they're rooted in the fact that they have an acceptance that we really are in an in-between kind of time. You know, they feel and commit strongly to the fact that some kind of significant phase shift is in play right now. You must all feel it in the work that you do.